Good morning and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. My name is Kelly Vlahos and I am the editor-in-chief of Responsible Statecraft. Before we go any further, please, if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. We need to beat the algorithm and grow our audience. I am very excited to have two friends on the show today. I am welcoming Jim Antle, executive editor of the Washington Examiner, who I had the pleasure of working with when he was editor of the American Conservative, and Jack Hunter, political reporter and analyst who writes regularly for Responsible Statecraft and the American Conservative. Welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
Yeah, very excited. The political world is reacting this week to the death of Senator Lindsey Graham, 71-year-old, died suddenly. And, lots of eulogies are coming in, but also a lot of grave dancing as well. He had made a reputation as a foreign policy hawk and one of the key drivers behind U.S. interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and the U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, and the current conflict in Iran. He had just returned from Ukraine before he died. In my own piece for Responsible Statecraft, I called him one of the loudest and proudest Cold War warriors, a foreign policy born in an era of Ronald Reagan, but for all intents and purposes burning out under George W. Bush and Obama. Sagar and Jetty over at Breaking Point said that if all those conflicts were failures that I just mentioned for American foreign policy, it was because Graham didn't think we did enough fighting and enough intervening. Here is Crystal Ball at Breaking Point. Let's cut to Chris.
This is a man who supported and pushed for the Iraq War, saw what a disaster that was. I still don't think that he would say it was the wrong thing to do. He never learned from how much of a disaster the foreign policy that he loved and that he advocated for, how consistently disastrous it was for the world, first and foremost for the countries that we were attacking, but also for the U.S.
But these eulogies are not all one dimension. Here is Democrat Dick Durbin of Illinois. Cut one, Chris.
I served with Lindsey Graham in the Senate for more than 2 decades. And during that time, I counted him as a trusted friend. I will tell you, Mr. President, that my friends and supporters back in Illinois many times would just shake their head and say, Durbin, what are you doing with Lindsey? You shouldn't be working with him. They didn't know how the Senate works, and they certainly didn't know him.
Meanwhile, others have raised Graham's political acumen. Our good friend, Michael Brendan Doherty, called him funny, magnanimous, an extremely effective advocate for his views. When he interviewed Senator Graham in his own piece at Unheard, Sohrab Ahmari said that Graham's loyalty and personal warmth paid dividends and gathered compound interest, which he would then cash out when it came to promoting his own pet causes. So how will history treat Lindsey Graham? Jack, you're in South Carolina. You've been writing about the senator for many years. We talked a little bit offline. You said you've been getting a lot of texts and inquiries in terms of your point of view in the wake of his death. Can you talk a little bit about how history might treat Senator Graham and maybe speak a little to the sort of dichotomy of people's remembrances of the late senator?
There's a few ways to come at this, and I want to address what said in that clip. She said she thought that Lindsey Graham never admitted that the Iraq War was a mistake. That's a firm opinion. In 2016, Lindsey Graham was running for president. And Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio were sort of pressured into saying what has become an American consensus at this point. Yes, the Iraq War, they had to be pushed into it. Graham held that never said It was a mistake. He said it was the right thing to do, and I'd do it all over again. As far as South Carolina and Lindsey Graham and his leg, look, you can't get around, see, which is the neoconservative foreign policy vision and war. George W. Bush, I've heard, is a great guy. We know he likes to pay and whatnot, but his legacy will always be the war. Am I wrong to say that? That could be separate from one's personality. Adolf Hitler like dogs. I don't want to get that extreme. I'm not calling anybody Hitler. See what I'm saying? The legacy of Lindsey Graham, he's up at the American Conservative today about this. As a South Carolinian, he entered Congress as a member of the House of Representatives in 1995. He became a U.S. Senator in 2003, months before the U.S. invaded Iraq. Until about 2007, he was indistinguishable from so many Bush-Cheney Republicans because they considered support for that war and the Patriot Act and torture and all that part of their party core identity. But as the country began to sour, 2007, 2008, the polls show America don't want this anymore. He not only got more boisterous, but more grim and ominous in how he wished death in places like Iraq, where McCain wanted to send 20,000 more troops in 15 to Syria and Iraq, and saying that a nuclear bomb up in my hometown of Charleston if we didn't do something about Syria. And then just 3 months before he died, he was, hey, we did Iwo Jima, we can take Kharg Island and Iran again. And American soldiers and Matt Walsh and some other conservatives like, hey, is this really worth sacrificing Americans for? I'm sorry, the niceties, and I can't blame senators who are being professional, but there was a friend, I'm sure, to so many. That's his legacy, and it's monstrous. And people in South Carolina think that, and people across the country think that, and there's good reason to. I don't like grave dancing. About one of my least favorite people I've the least liked from my perspective in American politics for my entire adult life. I don't like it. I don't think the answer is to become more like Lindsey Graham and also follow in death. Is to be like, good God, what a ghastly figure who did do that, and maybe we shouldn't be like Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. One of the points that Sohrab Ahmari was making was that restrainers need to be more like Lindsey Graham. Like we need a keen strategist like that, somebody who's going to make those hard political decisions and to bank all that capital to get what we want later. Jim, what is your take on that? And in more general, I mean, you're in a newsroom in which I'm sure there are mixed views about Lindsey Graham today.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, to me, the tragedy of Lindsey Graham is that he was very good at what he did, but a lot of what he did wasn't very good. And so, but he was, you can't really deny his effectiveness as a politician, as a communicator. He should have become irrelevant when Donald Trump became president. He was on track to becoming irrelevant. Instead, unlike most people in his wing of the party, many of whom are no longer even in the Republican Party functionally, even George W. Bush is somewhat marginalized within the Republican Party. Lindsey Graham actually in the Trump era became more important than ever before. And while I think that influence was mostly bad, you got to pay tribute to the skill of the guy. And I do agree with Sohrab in that there are benefits to playing the game, and a lot of very principled people don't like to do that. And the people who resisted this type of foreign policy on the right when Bush and Cheney were really defining what the right was, to be able to do that in that kind of climate requires a certain personality type and a certain temperament that isn't always as conducive to success once you're in a governing coalition. And so that's, I think, been a problem that we've had to face, is that in many respects, Lindsey Graham is just better at the game. Now, I think in the first Trump term, Rand Paul and Lindsey Graham competed very much for influence with Trump, and sometimes Rand came out ahead, and sometimes Graham did. But I'd have to give the nod to Graham in the second term, even though in the 2024 campaign, I'd argue Trump much more overtly campaigned on restraint-related themes, not just saying that things that had happened before him were bad, but saying that he didn't want to do these types of things anymore. And he brought a lot of restraint-minded people into his administration, all the way up to and including his vice president, J.D. Vance. But Lindsey Graham was still able to have a significant impact. And that's going to be the big question now that he's gone. Is anybody going to be able to fill that void? And perhaps the answer is no. And that's a real opportunity for restrainers, I think.
Yeah, I think that's one way of looking at it. Jim, do you have any thoughts on what changed? Because if Trump was campaigning like a restrainer, he certainly didn't behave like one once he was inaugurated. I mean, you remember we went right full bore for getting Greenland, going after narco terrorists, and then in the war with Iran. It just hasn't stopped since then. What was the shift, and was it just easier for Lindsey Graham to get his way because he saw an opening with this new spirit of intervention that Trump seemed to be pursuing?
Well, I think part of the problem is, so one of the reasons why Trump was so successful is he seemed to have hit the sweet spot politically on foreign policy, where he didn't want to do wars but was seen as tough. And that was a good balance. It also allowed a lot of Republicans with different foreign policy views, dramatically opposed foreign policy views, to each think that Trump really secretly more or less agreed with them. And that helped keep an unwieldy coalition together for the election. But when you govern, you have to start to make choices. And I think one of the ways in which Trump has sort of gone off the rails in the second term is he has done, and even if you go back to the first term, he did do sort of small, performative military strikes. And while I would question the wisdom and the morality of a number of them, they worked out well enough. And they worked out well enough largely because he confined himself to things that the military can actually do, not really any nation building or democracy promotion, and that he also knew when to quit when he was maybe not if ahead, at least a little bit less behind. Like he abandoned the stuff with the Houthis, and I think he really would like to get out of Iran at this point. But he got in, and I think the success, relatively speaking, or at least the non-disastrousness, the non-catastrophic nature of some of his smaller interventions, convinced him that the difference between himself and, say, George W. Bush or Lyndon Johnson was just that he was smarter and he knew how to manage these things better. Whereas his actual wisdom was that he understood that a lot of what we did, particularly in the Middle East, since the end of the Cold War, has been ill-advised and not worked out well. And so that was his real source of wisdom, and he kind of abandoned that by thinking, well, I'm just a better manager of these conflicts. And while he will never admit it, I suspect, based on how he's behaved in the last few weeks, he kind of knows that maybe that's not really true in Iran right now, that these things can't just really be managed away, that if you're going to try to do something of a George W. Bush scale, you're going to end up with George W. Bush-like results.
Yeah. So, Jack, just taking off on what Jim had suggested, that there is a hole now where Lindsey Graham stood in this inner orbit of the Trump administration, encouraging these interventions and aggressive policies, particularly in the Middle East, that this might be an opportunity for restrainers. Is there any figure that you can identify that is equally as politically astute that could fill that gap? Now, many would say that J.D. Vance was primed for that role. He is in an administration where, to me, seems to be outnumbered. But do you see an opening like Jim had suggested?
I'm a little confused about what we're talking about. Are we talking about who's in Trump's ear, or who gets to be the new maniac neocon in the two different roles? It could be anybody. I mean, people who know much more than I, in my limited knowledge, Trump listens a lot to the last person We've seen that over, a term and a half now, and I liked it a lot more when he was listening to Rand Paul. J.D. Vance, if his his influence, I think that would be a welcoming thing. In the Senate, Ted Cruz is positioning himself to be the, old Bush Cheney old guard decides to run for president in 2020. The Senate, I don't know if he's going to amp up his rhetoric. But yeah, J.D. Vance having more influence with Trump would. Well, I don't think he wanted to go into Iran. President, your president did. So what you going to do?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I want to talk about J.D. Vance and his prospects in 2028 in a little bit, but let's get to the midterms. Unless you guys have anything else to say about Lindsey Graham, are we?
I would add that what Sorbamari said. Look, I've been asked for almost 30 years by conservatives outside of South Carolina, why do you keep re-electing the guy? He's awful. Blah. He with constituent services when he was in South Carolina, not Israel, which was a little different in later years. And he was a good Chamber of Commerce Republican, which goes a long way with businesses and stuff like that. Even like the Tea Party era in 2010, I would speak at these rallies. We're going to get Graham. We're going to feed him. Nobody ever could. And you find a conservative Republican that was like, yeah, Lindsey, he's great. You could not find them, and yet he got reelected every time. And it has to do with that retail politics and that personality that I described. So,
yeah.
And Graham really understood Trump. He understood his motivations. He understood sort of how Trump thinks. The whole thing of comparing him to Barack Obama and say, oh, you should do the opposite of whatever Obama did. That is clearly a line of thinking that works with Trump. And in politics, I think you can't really replace personal relationships. And Graham was pretty good on that score.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you saw that borne out in Dick Durbin's comments that I've been seeing from Democrats and other members of Congress throughout. I mean, he really does hail from that old school Senate collegiality, despite political and ideological differences that we don't see too much of today. And that's an understatement. But since we're talking about the Senate, let's get into these midterms. So the magic number for the House for the majority is 218, and Republicans now hold a slim majority, which is 218 today. In the Senate, Republicans hold 52 to 48 majority. The GOP very threatened in both chambers. In a recent New York Times feature, every major pollster that they talk to is anticipating a House takeover, but by another slim margin. And the Republicans are holding on, in their estimation, to the Senate, or there being an even split, by which Vice President Vance would have to come in more times than not to break ties. Jim, I keep hearing about a blue wave and a GOP crack up before the midterms. What are you seeing out there?
Well, it's sort of an interesting dynamic. And so this midterm election campaign is, usually when you have a wave election, a blue wave or a red wave, it's a combination of the national climate moves very much against the party in power, but also they're particularly exposed in a number of seats. So there are a number of competitive districts or easy picking. There may be some of the Senate races don't favor the party in power, and it's usually the combination of those two things that creates a wave. So right now we definitely have a national political climate that's very bad for Republicans, but they may not be quite as exposed at the congressional district level, and a lot of the Senate races that are in play this year are in purple to red states. So that's going to be the real challenge. And Republicans, through redistricting, have tried to sort of cement this number. So in the last blue wave in 2018, when Democrats picked up 40 House seats, Republicans represented a couple of dozen congressional districts that had been won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. And of course, they took a bath in those districts in November. They got blown out. But this time around, they're only holding like 2 or 3 seats that were won by Kamala Harris in 2024. So the majority, because of gerrymandering, because people have a tendency to move into places with politically like-minded neighbors, and because of how the districts have drawn, and because of all of these past wave elections that have knocked out all of the Democrats in conservative districts and all of the Republicans in moderate to liberal districts, there just isn't as much low-hanging fruit anymore. And so what I thought before Iran was that the likeliest outcome in this year's election was something like 2022, but bluer. So you remember Republicans all year long, we were talking about the red wave. National climate was very bad for Democrats. Looked like Republicans were going to win big. And then they did enough to win the House because the Democratic majority wasn't very big. But it really wasn't a wave, and they actually lost a seat in the Senate, and so it was a little disappointing. I thought that was probably what was going to happen for Democrats this year. It's good. Their numbers are going to look great all year. Republicans' numbers are going to look terrible. And they probably do win the House simply because the Republican majority is just so small, and the electorate has moved enough in their favor from 2024. But the win would be underwhelming. I do think with Iran and with the resumption of inflation that we've seen since the Strait of Hormuz problem that the Iran war caused and exacerbated, I do think that opens it up for potentially bigger Democratic wins. But that's really the name of the game. Can Republicans beat a bad national climate with a favorable map?
Yeah, I'd like to go to cut 3, Chris, that speaks to that issue very clearly.
If you're a Republican looking at an unpopular war and the potential for high gas prices into an election, the fact that the straits could open in 2 weeks or less is good news.
Yeah, and that was a PBS NewsHour. Jack, this is an issue that I know that you have been writing about, very much concerned about, that the war in Iran creating a snowballing effect on the U.S. economy. Doesn't seem to be getting better. We had a ceasefire that is, by all intents and purposes, off. The strait is now closed. There is still fighting occurring. Now Trump is saying that he controls the strait. He might start charging 20% on vessels going through this passage, which would obviously increase costs for not only the merchants, but it would slide down to consumers as well. How is this going to bode for Republicans this fall?
The old thing is, or perception is, that Americans don't really care about foreign policy. Strange thing to say, given how involved abroad in so many different ways. My favorite polling, Kelly, is talking to relatives on the 4th of July and Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like that. I know those holidays are a little far off, but most of those people that I know voted for Donald Trump. They don't like the Democratic Party. They're partisan. And most of them I've talked to, they come to me, try not to talk to my family and friends about this, talk about something else, but they come to me because they know what I do. And almost all of them, to a man, are not happy about Trump. They don't care about the Iran war as much as I do, or the threat you do, because it's just whatever. But they do care about the price of gas. You see it going up, and they associate the two. I think probably happening across the country, looting. For people who voted for Donald Trump, and I tend to agree with Jim. A lot of people on the right thought that in 2020 was going to be this big red wave. Never materialized. I run Adam Brandon of FreedomWorks. The head of FreedomWorks was doing an autopsy on that midterm election. He said, "Hey, we expected a red wave. It didn't happen. What do we got to do? We got to recalibrate here." I think that's with the Democrats, but I think that the main impetus is those gas prices are high. I've got kids. This costs a lot of money, and why are we fighting this again? And I would couple that with the piece I had responsible Statecraft today, sort of a left-right version of that. I think people in both parties, to the degree that they're aware of in Gaza and that we've paid for it and all that, we certainly that with the Democratic Socialists who were elected in New York and places like Maine and Colorado. I think a combination of that is disenchanted Republicans who are like, what in the hell are we doing at this Trump? I think that favors the Democrats, though maybe not in as big a way as, they anticipated.
Yeah, I do want to make a point of mentioning your article for Responsible Statecraft today, Jack. It's entitled Tucker Carlson's Left-Right Third-Party Dream. And you go into sort of the mechanics of what it would take for a third party to launch, but more importantly, that people on the right, like Tucker Carlson, are leaving the party. I mean, he's like the most high-profile member of the Republican Party to announce that he's breaking ties, is seeking some sort of coalition on the left and the right among populists. So not only on the war issue, but on economic issues as well. I see some common cause there and breaking away from the Washington establishment. So like I encourage anybody in the audience today to take a look at that piece to see where those dynamics are. Jim, I know a lot of people who had voted for Trump, not only the first time, but the second time, really believed in the idea that Trump was focused and committed to the working class, to re-engineering the U.S. Economy, to be more self-sufficient, to break away from globalization, the supply chain issues. Really, he had painted this really stark contrast between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats who he said were too absorbed in social issues like identity politics and woke. Now it's been, over a year and a half since inauguration, and it does seem like this president has been distracted by geopolitical issues that Americans are kind of struggling to figure out, what does this have to do with me? What about those bridges and jobs and all of those bread and butter issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really how he won the election. But I do think one of the areas that has caused this to shift a little bit is that the second term is a legacy term. It's how you define yourself historically. And Trump felt he saw a couple of opportunities to sort of reset the chess table in the global order. I think he believed that the Iranian regime was much closer to collapse than it actually was because of the protests and things of that nature. And he obviously was able to do what he did in Venezuela pretty quickly and easily, although that was really more of a decapitation move than replacing the entire regime. He basically just decapitated and did business with what's left, which he hasn't really been able to do in Iran. So I think he has kind of chased the shiny object. And so it's also led him, I think, when you look at the ballroom and you look at some of the beautification projects in DC. Now, I personally have less issue with those things than some of the things he's doing in foreign policy, because I don't think these are necessarily destructive things. They're not always wise things, but they're not as destructive. But when you have high prices, bad cost of living, and people aren't happy with the economy, people are going to say, well, why do we need to spend any money on a ballroom, even if the ballroom, maybe it's going to be privately financed, maybe it'll be taxpayer funding. Certainly people don't want tax dollars to go toward it. So I think Trump has sort of looked past this term to see how he'll be viewed. And I think, if he doesn't pivot back at some point to the things that got him in office, I actually don't think it's going to enhance his legacy or put his political movement in a very good position to succeed him in 2028, with the caveat that 2028 is still a lifetime away in modern politics.
Well, that's a nice segue to the other and last topic I'd like to tackle is 2028. I mean, there has been some speculation, and I don't know how much of it is driven by the media, that there will be a primary in 2028, and it will bring in Rubio and Vance basically fighting for that mantle, and that Trump has this impish impulse to fan that rivalry. Jim, I want to ask you first, because again, you work for a conservative newspaper. I would imagine these conversations happen every day in the newsroom. What is your sense of how much that is sort of confabulated that whole rivalry narrative? And how much do you think that there is a prospect for a real fight?
Well, ironically, the two of them get along pretty well, given that they're sort of in each other's way in terms of their ambitions. Rubio has said that he would support Vance if Vance ran for president. You know, I actually think Rubio is not behaving very much like a candidate, but he is the next best positioned person for Vance, other than Vance. I think that the problem is, unless Trump and Vance have a rift, which is something you can never rule out with Trump, or if Trump just decides he thinks Rubio is a better candidate, I think the set of political conditions that would make it inviting for Rubio to run would mean that he wouldn't be very well positioned for the general election. And conversely, I think if we're not talking about Iran anymore, if that war is over, I think Vance will be much better positioned to take some credit for that, and 2028 will look better. But I do think people will try to run against Vance in the actual primaries. I think the contest between Vance and Rubio, the part of it that is real is that for Trump, there's going to be a competition of sorts for Trump's favor, and Iran may play a pretty big role in that. So when Trump wanted to go into Iran, Rubio was much more out front in defending the war than Vance was, although Vance, for the most part, did play the good soldier role, but you can tell that Rubio's heart was in it quite a bit more, as you might expect. Then when it came time to maybe do a deal and wind things down, Vance was out front much more, and Rubio, while he didn't disparage the diplomacy in any way, he didn't seem as enthusiastic about it. So Vance in that moment had an opportunity to reconnect with his base without getting crossways with Trump. But, obviously international events can sometimes take on a life of their own. And when you start these things, they're not so easy to stop, I think, as the administration is perhaps finding out. So obviously, your deal has to work. You have to be able to walk away at some point. If it's just bomb negotiations until 2028, that's probably not going to do very much for anybody politically. But there's definitely a feeling that the future of the Republican Party, its direction, will be on the ballot in the 2028 primaries. And even if we don't see a Vance-Rubio contest, which people, I think, are more wishing into existence than actually the case, there will be other people with other views on who want to really turn the page, not just on Trump personally, but on some of the areas in which Trump is a little different than a conventional Republican. They want to turn the clock back on that. They're going to have some candidates of their own, and we're going to have to see how they do. Trump himself was obviously able to destroy anybody with those types of aspirations. Can Vance do that? Well, we'll find out, I suspect.
Yeah. Jack, do you have some thoughts on that? I specifically would like you to talk about how up until the most recent events in Iran and that conflict, Trump seemed to be pushing Vance out there as the face of negotiations, of the ceasefire, of the continued talks, and those talks broke down. Can you talk a little bit about how that might impact Vance moving forward? I take in hand what Jim said about we have time, and this could actually bode well for Vance if the war ends, and he is seen as some intervening factor of restraint. But I don't know. It seems to me that he might have been put out there specifically as a sort of, a sacrificial lamb. Or am I reading the room wrong?
I don't know that you're necessarily reading it wrong, but to Jim's point, I mean, Vance's future happens with the Republican Party, certainly in 2028, is going to hinge on what Trump decides to do between now and He's done as president.
Yeah.
And to the degree that it's in the us with a more realist or restraint perspective, we see negotiations, and Vance is out front. He's taken some kind of credit, but all the credit goes to Trump for, some kind of peace deal, blah, blah, blah. That's a good thing. It's good for Vance. It's good for those of us who want to see the U.S. dragged into mindless forever regime change wars that Donald Trump said he would not get us into. And here we are in the middle of one. I think Vance is for that. I think Vance has the ability, while the president is saying, I don't care. And if we have to do this and close the Strait of Hormuz, I'm not worried about it. That's not Vance's style. He talks about pocketbook issues and stuff that matters to people. He's that kind of. So to get away from that and also be the guy who's getting us out of the war, or a big part of that, I think is good for Vance and is favorable for the Republican Party. I would add as a side note, nobody mentioned this in particular, that Zoran Mamdani speech about the 4th of July, that the left was just like, oh, he's our leader, blah, blah, blah. And conservatives, I'm a libertarian, but like, look at this socialist jerk. We don't want any of this. The thing he didn't do in that speech was talk about identity politics, not a whiff of that from that democratic socialist. What did he do? He talked about a father standing over his bed and talking about the roof is leaking or whatever. Vance does that too from a right-leaning perspective.
Yeah.
Mamdani was smart to do that. What I'm getting at, that applies to Vance's what future success for him.
Okay, last question on the question of the MAGA base. Have you seen, each of you, I want to ask you the same question, a real erosion of that base over the course of the last year and a half, whether it be over the war, the Epstein files, the lack of focus on the economy? When the rubber hits the road, does Trump still have the support that he walked into his second term with, Jim?
So there are three types of MAGA, in my opinion. There is elite MAGA, which are the social media influencers, the podcasters, the journalists, the commentators, the people with some degree of a following. And that group has been very divided, particularly over Iran, but also other issues like Epstein files and how much Trump has focused on foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy, deportations going too far, not far enough. That group is a little split. The second thing that I think defines MAGA is just hardcore Republicans who love Trump. Trump still has most of those people. I don't think there's been much erosion there, and they trust Trump. So if Trump wants to do a ground war in Iran, they'll follow. If Trump says, let's reinstate something that's basically the Obama nuclear deal and get out of there, they'll be fine with that too. And so that group, I think, is very steady. But the third group, you were talking about Tucker earlier. We used to talk about Reagan Democrats. I say there's a group of voters now called Rogan Democrats, Joe Rogan Democrats. These anti-establishment sort of populist people who kind of like Bernie, kind of like Trump, are kind of swinging between the political coalitions, and just some people who are lower propensity voters in general. Mm-hmm. I think that's where Trump's probably had his most of his erosion. And those people were pretty important in 2024. I think they'd be very important to J.D. Vance if he were to be the nominee. And that's, I think, the area where Trump has had the most slippage, because those people supported Trump for more or less very issues-based reasons, and many of them don't feel that he's delivered on those.
Excellent points. Jack, you got the last word.
Yeah, especially that last group that Jim just described. I like the Rogan Republicans. I think that's, there are a lot of people. Joe Rogan was a Bernie bro for Trump. He never endorsed a candidate or got behind him in the way he did with Trump, appearing at events and stuff. That whole that whole culture, Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn and Oliver Carlson's a big part of that. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Steve Bannon and Megyn Kelly. I know I'm talking about podcasters, but a lot of people who never voted Republican or whatever listen to that and were down MAGA as it was campaigned on in 2024 and feel really let down, but they're still listening to these people. There's a huge audience, and the only people listening to like Mark Levin are over 8. Audience is dwindling, but your Tucker Carlson's, of course, Joe Rogan's, those audiences are big and even getting bigger. Could that help Vance in 28? I think if he played his cards right, it could. You also have to assure those people that it's not going to be another betrayal to the degree that Trump has been for them.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jack. Everybody, check out Jack's work at Responsible Statecraft. He's also popping up at the American Conservative. He's writing about these and other issues. And Jim, you write for the Examiner, but you write for other places too, like the American Conservative. Anywhere else people can find your stuff?
Anybody who wants to pay me.
Well, listen, I appreciate your thoughts and your insights, and I hope we both will come back on the show. Thank you to my producer, Chris, in the back end, and thanks to the audience. Please remember, wherever you're listening or watching, please give us a like or subscribe and help us build our audience. And until next time, trip the Beltway. Fantastic.